Your lunch, we are going to get started with our luncheon biomedical presentation offered by the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, morning for me. I'm still on Pacific time. I am Dr. Ayana Elliot. I am a doctorally prepared family nurse practitioner. I actually originally hail here from Washington, D.C., okay? Born and raised. I'm a disciple of the Union Temple Baptist Church, so I'm a Christian by belief. And I am so delighted to come and share with you all this afternoon to talk a little bit about HIV biomedical prevention. I am as I said, a family nurse practitioner and a specialist in HIV. I am the current medical director of community medicine at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. A huge chunk of my career as a nurse and a nurse practitioner for the last 22 years has been working with medically underserved and minorities in the federally qualified health center settings. So I know what it is to work for and work with my people. It is a passion and a commitment. A part of what I have done over the course of my career is health behavioral research around HIV and HIV prevention, as well as transgender health. And so I bring to you today a little bit of the science, but also some of the psychosocial dynamics of what it means around HIV prevention. So of all of the tools that we've had or we've developed for the last 40 years in this epidemic, over 40 years in this epidemic, come from a myriad of places, from biobehavioral to biomedical. And the one thing that I think is important whenever we're talking about HIV prevention and working with people, human beings, is that we have to first consider the vessel, the individual to whom we engage or intend to engage in any of these modalities. We first must consider what their concept and perception of themselves are, because we're talking about the effectiveness, the real effectiveness of any of these modalities first begins with a person's belief around what it means to protect a body that for many reasons someone has told has no value or no meaning. And so when you think about, ushering somebody into a place where they can choose an option to prevent a condition, the acquisition of a condition like HIV, you must consider what their concept is, right? And what shakes me and gets me going every day is that I lead from a faith-based place. As I said before, as being a Christian, this is where I lead in my clinical practice and understanding what a person's own perception of themselves, their self-esteem, their self-declaration and determination around me finding the proper intervention or methodology to use with them, because there's not a one-size-fits-all. You can't just give a person a pill or a shot and think that that's going to be the end-all solution. Many of these interventions have been the hard work of many individuals, some of whom I've worked with directly, from testing and getting people into care. I also think that it is important that we understand that for many reasons, through our distorted historical past with the medical auspices, that many people just don't want to go to a doctor, right? And so some of these things don't work if we can't get get people in the clinic or in the doctor's office. And so a lot of where our efforts have to begin is preaching the gospel about what it means to go and engage in health-seeking behaviors, like going to get a checkup, whatever that means. For all of the testing that we do and offering of testing, studies show that Blacks or African Americans are the most tested for HIV. We also happen to be disproportionately affected by HIV. We represent 13 or 14% of the US population, but we account for the greatest number of HIV incidences here in the United States. Where do we reinsert ourselves in the HIV prevention space around getting to a place where we're at zero infections, whether that's going to be 2024, 2027, or 2030? So some of our current prevention tools that we have, and really it's a mixed bag. And again, where and how we use them, at least in my clinical practice, really varies upon the individual with whom I'm working, because I understand that everything is not going to work for everybody. And so I have to do the work of assessing what's going to be most practical, right?
No, these are
What's going to be affordable, what's going to be acceptable to the individual, because the patient or the client is also participatory in this prevention plan that we put together. And so when I think about all of the resources that we have, we put this thing together, and we're going to call it a happy meal, okay? Because if the patient is not engaged in this prevention plan, then none of it works. So we can do all of this, and we can make all of these options, and we can coordinate care, and we can write the prescription, and we can send it to the pharmacy, and we can tell the patient to go and be great. But if they're not woefully involved in this, then none of it works. We've known for at least a decade plus that oral HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis works. Here is a demonstration of some of the pivotal trials that demonstrated for us that it can work, that it does work. I start with the earlier trials, like the IPREX trial, which brought us FTC TDF, also known as Truvada, a study done in men who have sex with men and transgender women. But then I juxtapose that to a study like FemPrep, a study which in the early part of its evaluation or analysis gave the impression that oral PrEP for cisgender women was not effective. And what a farce that was, until folks actually analyzed what it means for people to actually take the medication for it to work, understanding that adherence highly correlates with the effectiveness of the medication. The VOICE trial was also similar in that. Again, going back to my earlier point about their perception around risk for HIV acquisition, and then also the acceptability of the intervention that's being used. So here in this trial, as an example, you had these cisgender women in sub-Saharan Africa being given a prevention option, and they just didn't find it acceptable. They didn't take it, and thus this interpretation or the misinterpretation of the lack of efficacy of this medication had, roared through the scientific community for a little bit. But we were able to rebound from that and learn that in the Partners PrEP study that this actually did work. The Partners PrEP study was a study looking at oral PrEP in what is called serodiscordant partnerships. That's when one individual is living with HIV and the other is not. And then you had some other studies like PROUD and APRO-GAY that demonstrated what it was like to administer PrEP at varying schedules. So you have what's called 211 or on-demand PrEP, showing that the effectiveness of PrEP in the prevention of HIV through receptive anal intercourse is effective when at least 4 pills a week have been administered orally. The next gen, right? We're always looking to the future. The future is bright. It is important. And the consideration of where we come or where we have come and where we're going is quite magnificent. The new or more novel modalities for PrEP have brought us the PrEP ring, which I'll talk about in a second, and more options for oral PrEP, and now a long-acting injectable PrEP. So let me talk about Discover, which brought us our second oral PrEP medication in 2019. This is the second generation, if you will, the second generation PrEP medication orally taken once a day to reduce the risk of sexually acquired HIV. This study, the Discover study, was the largest oral PrEP trial of its time, enrolling both men who have sex with men and transgender women from 6 countries, including the United States. This trial studied what was known as FTC TDF Truvada, and then FTC TAF, which is now known as Descovy. Both shown to be highly effective and beneficial in the risk reduction of HIV acquisition. The HVTN 083 and 084, both trials were evaluating the efficacy of long-acting injectable cabotegravir. This is an intramuscular injection administered in the hip. Okay, every 2 months for the risk reduction of sexually acquired HIV, studied HVTN 083 in men who have sex with men and transgender women. I want to highlight that this study did a significant job of enrolling a high number of Black or African-American individuals, which was something historic in terms of PrEP trials. It also spoke to the clinical trial leaders' intentionality around evaluating the effectiveness of this medication in a population that's disproportionately impacted by HIV. And the outcomes of this trial were, of course, significant in that the HVTN 083 trial was looking at the long-acting injectable versus oral FTC TDF or Truvada. Now, as you can imagine, taking a pill every day versus getting a shot every 2 months. One is individual control. The other is slightly your control because you got to show up to get the shot. But when you give somebody, free rein to go and do what they do every day, and the only thing they have to remember to do is come and get the shot every 2 months, well, it's going to be a little bit better than taking that pill every day. And that's what HVTN 083 showed, that it was superior in effectiveness when it came to the injectable versus the pill, right? And there was no surprise, that it makes very logical sense. Like I see you guys shaking your head, right? The caveat to that, which I'll talk about in a second, is what it means in changing the dynamic of your engagement to the actual clinic space, because you can't go and run off, and not come to the clinic. You have to get that injection every 8 weeks. Okay, that's how we keep the protection going. 084 was similar in strategy. So this was, again, looking at long-acting injectable cabotegravir versus oral FTC TDF, also known as Truvada. This study actually looked at cisgender women, right? So this was an HIV prevention trial set up to evaluate the effectiveness of this medication in cisgender women. And the results in terms of superiority were similar, where cabotegravir was shown to be superior to the oral FTC TDF. And again, speaking about adherence being the difference factor in that, where seroconversions of those in the trial, particularly in the oral FTC TDF arm of the trial, was associated with non-adherence or low drug levels of the actual medication. And going back again to talk about what it means to change the dynamic of your engagement in the healthcare space, in that you no longer get the ability to go and come every 3 months, right? Or even do telehealth with my oral prep. That's really the mainstay. And I think one of the silver linings of our COVID pandemic is telehealth, right? So I do a lot of teleprep in my clinic. And that allows folks the freedom to still engage in healthcare, get their labs as required for the HIV testing for PrEP, and to continue to go and be great. Well, injectable PrEP does not do that, right? You got to come into the clinic every 2 months. And so we take these things with a grain of salt and say that, like we all believe that PrEP, like oral contraceptive technologies, should be multimodal. You should have multiple options. It should be like Burger King. You should be able to have it your way, okay? So I go back to talk a little bit about one of the technologies for PrEP that most excites me, but gives some people pause, and that's the Depivaring ring. This is a modality in which a vaginal ring is inserted every 28 days, shown to be effective about 35% on primary analysis, and then shown up to 50% in fact effective in risk reduction for HIV acquisition. This modality is approved in the European Medical Association, but is not approved for use in the US. And I say that the pause around the approval in the US may be around the level of effectiveness with 35 and 50%. But can I say to you that 50 is greater than 0? Okay. And so my adage is like the great Beyonce, put a ring in it. Okay. I like it. And I'm hopeful that that the folks in the powers that be will come to their senses. Again, being able to choose the way in which you receive your PrEP option is really the way to go. And to the idea that the individual, again, engaged in these prevention options are really the ones who drive, and it really will be the way that adherence will play out in the long end of HIV prevention. One of the things that I talk about when I do trainings around PrEP is that there's a lot of work to get the patient on, right? You do all of these things. You do education, you do awareness. You talk about the options. You guys choose an option. You write them a prescription. They go and pick up the prescription. And that prescription, they start taking it. And then 6 months later, what happens? They disengage. So there's even greater work with consistency or continuity. And I think that the key to that consistency or that continuity is finding the right methodology for prevention that will keep that person going, right? Even when they don't feel like they have the wherewithal to continue, we have to make it seamless. We have to make it marry well, blend well within their lives. And I think that will be the thing that supports the way in which protection or prevention for HIV will go, and they will endure for as long as a person can benefit from it. Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to Louis. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elliot. That was an amazing presentation. Again, my name is Louis Shackelford, he, him pronouns. I am acting director of external relations at the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. And before I launch into my 100 slides that I have to show you today, I just thought that was such a great presentation. I wanted to see if there were any questions or comments in the room before we move on.
Yes, the one last slide was I was really interested in. Do they still have to have lab work?
So the parameters around all of the pre-exposure prophylaxis modalities is testing at baseline, because you want to make sure that the person is not living with HIV. One, because if they are, the appropriate thing would be that you need to treat them. Right. And so anything that you do after that, if you give them inadequate medication to treat the HIV, you set them up for the potential for drug resistance. So testing at baseline and then at a regular frequency. So for all of the PrEP modalities, we currently do it every 3 months, right?
They'll do it every 3, even if they get the ring, they still have to do it every 3 months.
Yeah.
That's some of the things that's been kind of hard. People don't want to do the lab.
Well, it's not like there's not a good rationale and basis behind it. And when you think about it, it makes sense, because how often would you test them, right? If you test them a year later and you have them on this ring where they're getting a low level of drug, you potentially, as I said, run them into the risk for resistance, because they're getting something, but it's not enough, right?
A quick question for you regarding the injectables. One, when you're running your baselines, do you still do your liver function tests as well with your STI testing? And also, what are do they run the same side effects as the oral administered PrEPs?
Sure, great question. So the question about side effect profile between the two medications, and in my practice, I'm a person that I like to know where we are from the outset. So all of the lab screening, I will do baseline screenings of both kidney and liver, which vary between the medications, right? The actual requirements from the manufacturer varies, but what I do clinically is different. Yes. And then also what's required versus what you do as a clinician. So there'll be somebody who will practice differently from me, and there'll be someone who practices different from that person. So to answer your question, I'm going to do baseline. I'm going to study liver. I'm going to study kidney function just to assess, right? The impact for your specific question around injectable is not known to be impactful to the liver, but moreover, from that side effect profile, GI side effect, right? Yes, all of the GI stuffs, yeah, dyspepsia, nausea, yes. And the orals would be nearly similar. With the injection, you also have injection site reaction. So that's a little bit different. And then I didn't talk about during my presentation what happens with individuals who are going on to long-acting injectable PrEP, but then for whatever reason, may choose, or their situation may change and they need to go off. There's a whole piece around what do you do about when they go off and covering the long duration of the medication in their system, right? So those individuals who go off the long-acting injectable will need some continued coverage through oral PrEP medication because of the long, what we call tail of the injectable medication. So that's a whole nother responsibility, right? Okay.
My question, I think you pretty much answered my just now, but also I like to know, do you have someone following them once they start the process to make sure they follow through? Like maybe a community health worker?
Yeah, so the challenge, as we learned, so we've had injectable PrEP for almost a year, right? And what we're learning about the necessity, well, what we already knew from oral PrEP is that the necessity to track folks down, like the surveillance folks, when you contract an STI and they come looking for you. Well, it feels almost the same from my perspective. We have a small program where the injectable folks, because we don't have a huge set of them in my practice, that we can do that. But when you're talking about large clinical settings where you have hundreds of people on, it is a task, and you do have to have dedicated people, because those who have less than adequate engagement in healthcare, those people who are not the on-time people, the people who want to come back 10 weeks instead of 8 weeks, somebody needs to be looking for them, right? And so to your question, that is an important part of long-acting injectable PrEP, to have that. And it's a mixed bag for, what an organization does and doesn't have, but it's something that you have to sort of plan out in the outset of having the long-acting injectable PrEP program.
I wanted to go back to the ring and ask two questions. Do you think that have you all anticipated what the ring will cost in the US? And if insurance companies will allow people to use their insurance to be able to get the ring?
Sure. So, well, first, let me start by reiterating the approval in the US for the ring is not there yet. So guesstimating about what coverage would look like, I can only imagine. What I can say about our great US health insurance system is, how they are, right? And if there's a financial cost difference, you can imagine the response will be consistent with that cost savings. But who knows? I would be hopeful that if it was approved, that like we have talked about, is that the individual would be able to have the option to choose the PrEP option that they want. What I can say is what we have seen with oral versus injectable PrEP is that many people who have commercial insurance, that's the Aetnas, the Blue Cross, all of those insurances, they're not getting choices. They're being directed towards oral first, and then being made to demonstrate that they cannot, for whatever reason, tolerate the oral in order to get the injectable. So it's our great US healthcare system.
We're going to take two more questions. We have Allison, and we have this.
Yes, I've gotten questions from the community about the injectable PrEP for women, and about how long does it take for injectable PrEP to provide protection for women, because we know it takes about 30 days for the pill. So I've had that question. I didn't have the answer. I didn't know if you knew something about that.
No, and I would love to get you the answer to that. I thought what you were going to ask me is about the long duration in women, and the demonstration that the medication seems to hold longer in the cisgender body person. But in terms of time to effectiveness, it's always a tricky question. With oral, we've bounced around. We've said 21 days time to effectiveness with oral in the person who's at risk for acquiring HIV through receptive vaginal intercourse. And I want to harp on that because we use the term woman and we don't talk about parts. We're talking about people, but it's really about parts, right? The medications and their effectiveness and the correlation between that is consistent with what parts people use and where they go. Okay. But thank you. And so I will make sure that we can connect so I can get you that specific answer. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been quite interesting education here that you're giving us. My question is maybe just, is there anything going on in the research world for cisgender women on the 211? I mean, we know it's not approved here yet, but is there any research on that? Maybe some women might prefer to do, 211, if they plan to, instead of being on a continuous medication, they want to just use it within that time frame and then leave it alone. Is there anything in the works?
Sure. So I'm going to take your question and go back to what I talked about in answering the last question, is that the time to protection in the oral tablet is said to be, the guideline is 21 days. We know that vaginal tissue concentration of the oral PrEP medications are a little bit longer. And so when you conceive that idea, the benefit of 211 in the person who's at risk for acquiring HIV through receptive vaginal intercourse might not be adequate. Okay, I'll say it like that. And I don't know about any current studies looking at sort of on-demand PrEP in people who are at risk for acquiring HIV through receptive vaginal intercourse. But I would like it, right? Because that's important. What I can say moreover from that is about the purpose trials. These are the trials that are looking at FTC TAF, also known as Descovy, in cisgender women, right? In sub-Saharan Africa and a few places here in the US, around FTAF and long-acting lenacapavir, an injectable PrEP medication administered sub-Q, not IM, sub-Q every 6 months, right? And so here again is our Burger King menu expanding where folks can have it a different way. And they're also but they're also studying the use of Descovy in cisgender women.
Maybe just a bullet about sub-Q versus IM.
Sure.
Thank you.
So sub-Q, do we have any diabetics? Not that people need to disclose their health information, but if I could use my diabetics as an example, so sub-Q, this is subcutaneous. This is the fatty tissue, right, in the body. So commonly the back of the arms, depending on, I don't know, looking at me, that's not me, really. But let's use Lewis's. So subcutaneous, back of arms, abdomen, where you have a little bit of the fat tissue. The needle is probably 2 inches or so long, and that medication is going into the fatty tissue that's subcutaneous. Intramuscular is just what it sounds like. It goes into the muscle. So that's a longer needle that's going in, that goes through the subcutaneous fat down to the level of being under the muscle. Quite a contrast in terms of administration, and it's something that many people can try. Will be the difference between what it is to have an option for an injectable PrEP medication especially people who have tyrannophobia, or what we call fear of needles. So thank you, Daniel, for highlighting sort of the need to point those two out. And when you think about it, right, sub-Q versus IM, we'll learn a lot more about what it means to administer these two modalities in these different capacities.
I wanted to, Dr. Matthews left, but her question about CAB-LA, I know we have animal models that suggest that 7 days after the first injection, about 95% of people should have protective levels of CAB-LA. But to Dr. Elliott's point, I have no idea what that means for women in particular, or what it means for people in particular, since animal models is all we have right now. So I'd be interested in knowing what you discover also.
Sure. And to that end is that even though we know a lot, even about the oral drugs, as a scientist myself, I know that what our guidelines around these time to protection measures aren't woefully rooted and aligned with the science, but we need guidelines, right? And they help keep us safe. And so, yes. And so I want to be able to answer the question from a guideline standpoint versus the scientific standpoint. Yeah, so that's why I said let me go and do some intel and come back to you with that answer.
Thank you.
Before we let Dr. Elliot go, I just wanted to make sure there weren't any questions online that we haven't addressed. Are there any? Okay. Well, with that, can we give a round of applause to Dr. Elliot? Thank you. All right, so I guess you all are stuck with me now. Dr. Elliot is so composed and proper when she presents. She always gets at me because I use my hands a lot when I present and do a whole bunch of stuff with my hands. And so I'll try to be more like Dr. Elliot and be a little bit more composed and proper. But I appreciate her. I appreciate her being a part of this presentation today. So again, my name is Louis Shackelford. He, him pronouns. I am Acting Director of External Relations at the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. And so the way I hope this is going to go is that, Dr. Elliot gave you such a great overview of where we are and kind of, not just what the landscape is right now, but kind of the cutting edge. And so I hope to give you a little bit of insight on the bleeding edge from our standpoint at the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. So I have about 100 slides to show you, and I'm going to get through them in about 20 minutes. So let's see how that works. So before I move on, before I do anything, I cannot do anything without acknowledging the passing of the late, great Dr. Stephon Wallace. I would not be here, standing here with you today, if it wasn't for Dr. Wallace. He is a mentor, my supervisor, the leader of my team. He was such a great friend. And in many ways, I've come to learn over the past month processing his passing that he was a compass to me in my life. And I know he was a great compass and a great champion in many of the lives of people in the community, including some of those in this room. We use the term people's champion a lot, like rappers use it to talk about they're the people's champion. But I feel like for the first time, I can use that term and it actually makes a lot of sense. So I also want to acknowledge Dr. Elliott's presence in Dr. Wallace's life. He and Dr. Elliot go way, way back to way further than I've known him. But he always told me stories about how she would help guide him and help mold him into the man that he was. And so I know how Dr. Elliot didn't get a chance to talk about him, but I just want to acknowledge that she was a pivotal figure in his life. And I know that he means all the world to her, as he does to me and so many others. All right, so before I start crying, I'm going to start talking about the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, what I got. So the HIV Vaccine Trials Network is an international collaboration. We are scientists, we are clinical trial sites, we are community representatives, and we also incorporate people from the US government. And so I just want to linger on that community part because, you know, a lot of times we get up and give these presentations and we talk about science and we talk about what we're doing, but we don't talk enough about the community, and we wouldn't have the science that we have. We wouldn't be able to do this work without the community. And so you are a part of this just as much as any of the scientists that we have. And so the HVTN is the largest publicly funded clinical trial program devoted to finding an effective and safe HIV vaccine. We are funded by the Division of AIDS and the National Institutes of Health. And every once in a while, we get the honor and privilege to work with great partners on projects such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Janssen. So I really just wanted to give you an overview of what our organization looks like. So, you know, we have different parts. I am at the Leadership and Operations Center. We also, that's where we do our administrative work in leading and operating the Vaccine Trials Network. But we also have the Statistical Data Management Center. Those are the folks that process all the data that we get from our studies. And then we have, of course, the Laboratory Center, you know, all the specimens, everything that we generate that comes out of our studies has to be processed at a lab. And so those are our lab folks. And so in the center of that are our participants. We can't do the work that we do without our participants. They are the most important piece of the puzzle, and that's why they're at the center of the graphic that you see here. And then encompassing that graphic is the sites. So all across the United States, all across the world, we have clinical research sites located in different parts of this country and different parts of countries where we work. And to give you a little overview, here's a little map, and then the blue highlighted parts are countries throughout the world where we have clinical research sites. Those sites are key because those are the ones on the ground, those are the people on the ground doing the work. They are engaging communities, they are seeing participants, they are the ones that receive participants and guide them through studies. I actually came from a clinical research site in New York City, where I was born and raised. Came from the Harlem Prevention Center. And so I have experience working at a site. And so the sites are very near and dear to my heart because they are the heart of what we do, because everything that we do in leadership funnels down to the sites. I said I was going to use my hands, right? And so we have over 100 sites across the world. And as of today, we've enrolled over 30,000 participants across the world. I like the that makes me feel good. So why HIV vaccine is needed? Why are you up here talking to me right now, Louis? Why can't we just be doing something else we just ate? So I just like to come back to numbers like this. And so these all come from the CDC. And I like this because it shows that no matter what your gender identity is, no matter what your sexual orientation is, whether you are a person of trans experience or a gender non-conforming experience, whether you are identify as a Black queer person, or if you're a regular smuggler, you know, straight guy like me, we see that across the board, HIV disproportionately impacts people of color, particularly Black people. And so what that shows me is that all these great interventions that we have, and Dr. Elliot gave a great overview of what the landscape is right now. It worries me that we're still disproportionately impacted, and it makes me feel like there's more to do because people are getting left out. And so you could say to me, well, Louis, that was just 1 year. What does that mean? This is a graph that shows progress in terms of race and identity from 2017 to 2021. And it shows how much the needle has moved considering new HIV diagnosis. And you see that it really hasn't. For many of these populations, there's been no movement, and it's a travesty that we can look at, Hispanic, Latino populations, and all the graph says it's just stable, no movement. So what that tells me is that there's room for more, that people are getting left out with our current interventions. And as Dr. Elliot said, we need more of a Burger King philosophy, that we don't have everything our way, and that maybe we need more options. And we can also talk about stigma, we can talk about discrimination, we can talk about those things, and that's a great conversation to have as well. But what I'm going to speak to for the rest of this presentation is really the options that we are exploring at the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. But always keep in mind that we are not deaf to all of the structural oppression that exists both in this country and across the world. And so that is why we find it so important to engage people like you and in making sure that whatever is created by the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, it is something that the community has a hand in from the beginning and that the community can champion moving forward. See how I'm doing on time. Okay, I got a little bit left. So again, why this vaccine thing is important. So we can talk about a whole lot of different reasons. I'm going to give you 3 today, and so I think one, first and foremost, is that prevention is key. The rate of new HIV diagnosis that we have, particularly across the world, we're not going to treat our way out of this epidemic. We need to focus on prevention. We need greater prevention tools to curb new HIV diagnoses. The second thing is that, and we all kind of know, is that pills are often not preferred by many people in our populations that are disproportionately impacted. And so a vaccine would be a great alternative to having to take a pill every day. And so I'm in the agreement, this is kind of Louis talking, not acting director of external relations, that we're not going to pill our way out of this epidemic. And then lastly, historically, vaccines have shown themselves to be a safe and effective option to getting out of any pandemic, epidemic that we've gotten ourselves into as human beings. And they've also been shown to be a cheap option. And so you may think, Louis, are you really telling the truth? I got some slides to say that I am. And so over the decades, most commonly we've seen that vaccines have really transformed the way we live, particularly if you are a young person in this world or an older person in this world, because those are the populations that have suffered the most from viruses of all types. And so we've seen that vaccines have done a tremendous job of increasing life expectancy of all populations, including the 2 that I just mentioned. They've shown to be safe when manufactured properly. They've shown to be cost effective. And we've done things like eliminated smallpox worldwide through the use of vaccines. So we are confident that an HIV vaccine could have the same effect in curbing this epidemic in a major way. And just for a little insight, this slide gives you a little view of what the world looked like before a particular vaccine and what it looked like after. So you can take the view at the very top of measles, for example, and the annual amount of cases that we saw before the advent of vaccines. And then we see today with a vaccine, what that looks like. And so you go down the list and it's just over and over and over, we see tremendous effectiveness of vaccines to radically change our world for the better and stave off viruses of all different types. So what would that look like for HIV? What could the possibilities be? So I love this slide because it shows the potential impact of an HIV vaccine and how an HIV vaccine that may not be all that effective from our perspective could actually still have a tremendous impact. So if you look at on the right side of this graph, when you see efficacy, we're looking at a vaccine of efficacy 30%. So a vaccine that works 30% of the time in preventing HIV, and 20% of people, let's say in the United States, take it, or worldwide take it, I should say. We are looking at curving potentially 5.5 million infections. So that's 5.5 million new HIV diagnoses that we would be able to avoid just by a slightly, a moderately, I should say, effective vaccine. And then those numbers go up tremendously. If you look at the bottom on the right, you see a 70% effective vaccine, a vaccine that works 70% of the time at preventing HIV. That's taken by 40% of the people worldwide, just 40%. 40%, 4 out of 10 people. We could potentially stave off 28 million new HIV diagnoses. So the scientists that I'm working with are doing their best to have a vaccine that's highly effective. And so we are really excited about what a vaccine can do just from these projections. Now, it's been a long time. HIV has been around for a long time. And a lot of people are saying, where's our vaccine? We've been working on this. Where is it? And so this slide we throw in here to give you a little bit of perspective about how long it takes to develop vaccines. And we use different vaccines throughout our history, human history, and how long it took to go from discovering disease to now having an effective vaccine. And so you see, for some, it's taken almost 100 years. For some, not that long. So just to give you some perspective, we are working very diligently and we're hopeful to have a vaccine as soon as possible, but it may take some time. And we can talk about the challenges with HIV specifically. What makes HIV challenging compared to, let's say, a virus like COVID? COVID is a very samey virus. It looks very much the same throughout person to person. A lot of times each different type of COVID looks pretty similar, whereas HIV, we don't have that luxury. HIV is not a very samey virus. It changes a lot. It rapidly changes. A person can produce 1 million HIV copies in a day. So HIV is way, way, way trickier than many of the viruses we have faced in the past. And so I think I'm going to leave it at that. I heard a funny thing is, I heard a scientist say that HIV is also a very bald virus, which I thought was funny. And they were referring to the little spikes. We hear about the spike proteins on the COVID virus. And, those spike proteins are prominent throughout. That's why it's called a coronavirus, because it looks like a crown, because all these spikes. Those spikes not only stay the same, but they're all over the virus. Whereas HIV doesn't have a lot of those spikes. It does some of the things. It uses those spikes to kind of attach to our cells and infect a particular cell, but it doesn't even have as many spikes as COVID does. So just think about that in terms of how different it is. That not only we target that spike over and over for all of our COVID-19 vaccines, and thinking about not only is that target rapidly changing with HIV, but there's much fewer of them on HIV itself. All right, so I think I kind of went through this already, so we'll move on. This slide talks about just showing a little bit about the genetic diversity of HIV. So you can look at humans, and humans from me to Wakefield right in front of me, you know, there may be a 10 to 30% difference in us genetically. You know, even though we're two light-skinned Black men, there may be like a 10. So you're light-skinned to me, Wakefield. There may be a 10 to 30% difference in us genetically in HIV across the world. I'm sorry, and there may be just a 1% difference, a 0.1% difference between me and Wakefield. Whereas HIV across the world is a 10 to 30% difference in how much diversity we see in HIV. So there's a lot more diversity going on in HIV. There's a lot more difference going on in HIV. So, all right. So just giving you a little overview of how we do our work. How do we test an HIV vaccine? So it goes from idea, that idea goes into research in the lab. We usually, from the lab, we produce something, and then that is tested in animals. And then from animal tests, we're able to move on into what we call clinical trials in people. It's a little overview of sizes of clinical trials. I'm not going to go into this for sake of time, but just understanding that phase 1 trial, we're really looking at small groups of people. So this is usually less than 100 people. And we're really looking at, is it safe to give whatever this is to a person? The second phase, a few hundred people. And now we're looking at a little safety, but we're also starting to look at to see what we're doing. Is it working? And then phase 3 is when we get into the large scale trials where you get thousands of people. And now you're really looking at, how does this thing work in the real world? So just keep that in your back pocket. You may need that later on in this presentation. And I just wanted to talk about our global CAB. So we have CABs at each of the research sites that are part of our network, but we also have a global CAB, and they are responsible for giving input on all of the research that comes through the HIV Vaccine Trials Network and making sure that the research is being done in a way that is relevant to communities, that is acceptable to communities across the world. So, big takeaway from this slide is I just want you to know that we in no way are giving HIV to people. So an HIV vaccine does not contain active HIV. So it will not infect you with HIV if you were to participate in the HIV vaccine trial. So just wanted to acknowledge that. For the sake of time, I'll move on. So the big picture, this is the slide that I really wanted to get to. And so this really gives you an overview of what we're doing and the two big methods, the two big takeaways of how we're doing research. Because these are the two big buckets of research that we are undertaking now at the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. And so on one side, you have active immunizations or vaccines. So vaccines teach your body how to make antibodies. And antibodies are really, really crucial because they help your body to not just identify a virus, a foreign substance, but it also helps to neutralize a virus once it gets into your body. And neutralizing means that it just stops the virus from infecting your cells and doing damage to your body. So the great thing about a vaccine is that it's going to give you ongoing protection Of course, that infection is not going to be immediate. We learned that from COVID, that it's going to take you a little bit of time to build up enough immunity once you get that initial vaccine. And that could be 2 to 3 weeks to generate that sort of immune response so you have that protection. But we also benefit from that protection lasting a long time. Once it's built up, it can last for the years. But we also know that vaccines can also have side effects. Many people have had the COVID-19 and they have gone through different side effects. So, that's those are kind of the pros and cons of a vaccine. This other idea, broadly neutralizing antibodies, is what if we, instead of giving you a vaccine that teaches your body how to make these antibodies that you need to fight HIV, what if we just gave you the antibodies? And so that's the other idea that's really important that we've been researching. And so what if we just do direct, it can be either IV infusion or it can be a shot, intramuscular shot that Dr. Elliot spoke about earlier, of BNABs, broadly neutralizing antibodies. And these antibodies are already shown to be able to neutralize many different types of HIV. And so that's why they're broadly neutralizing, that not only do they do the work of neutralizing or stopping HIV from infecting your cells, but they also have been shown to do it across many different types of HIV. And so this would give you almost immediate protection from HIV. So once you have that infusion, within a few hours, you would have protection. However, that protection probably wouldn't last as long as a vaccine. It may last you for a few months as opposed to a few years. And so that means that you would have to potentially have repeated infusions of antibodies. That could be every 6 months. So these are the two big buckets of research that we've been undertaking. And let's see, how am I doing on time? I got like 5 minutes left. So any questions about those two things? I think I'm going to stop there and maybe move to our faith part of. Okay, sure. Okay. So Ulysses just told me that I have more time than I thought. So I appreciate that. So just looking at how vaccines work. So they basically, as I said before, they teach your body how to recognize a virus, in this case about HIV. They sound the alarm, let the immune system know, hey, there's a virus here, we need to take care of it. They help to fight it by neutralizing it. And once it's neutralized, they also call in other cells to come and destroy HIV, basically. And that's the goal, for HIV to be killed and removed from the body. So there really are kind of 3 standards that we're looking at when it comes to vaccines. So the gold standard would be a vaccine that just prevents infection, meaning that you get this vaccine and you are protected from getting HIV. Boom, in the story. That would be the gold standard. So the silver medal, so to speak, would be a vaccine that combats infection and clears it from the body. So think more in line with the COVID-19 vaccine, whereas you may still get infected, but it's going to clear that infection quickly. It's going to kind of help your body control that infection and clear it from the body very quickly. That would be what we consider the silver medal for an HIV vaccine. And then the bronze medal would be an HIV vaccine that doesn't necessarily prevent infection, but prevents or delays the progression of virus, which in this case would be an AIDS diagnosis. So even if we're able to slow it, not prevent infections, but just slow the progression to an AIDS diagnosis, that alone would help to prevent millions of deaths across the world. So those are kind of the three ways that we look at development of a HIV vaccine and the three kind of things that we're shooting for. And then there's this thing about community immunity. You probably heard this as herd immunity. I don't like using herd immunity because I'm not a cow. You're not a cow. We're not cows. I don't want to be a cow, and I don't want nobody to call me a cow. So what we call community immunity is really building up the immunity across people so that there's protection even for those who are not vaccinated. And so if you look at the graphic, you see that without immunity, a virus can just spread wildly across a community. But when there's a little bit of vaccination, the virus spreads more slowly. And then when there's a lot of vaccination in the community, the virus has a very hard time spreading across the community because there's just not as many places to go. And so this phenomenon is called community immunity. Again, you'll probably hear it as herd immunity, but I just wanted to give you a sense of that because that's really important. And having a vaccine would allow us to get some level of community immunity. So kind of talked a little bit about antibodies already, but they are proteins, they're part of the immune system. Specific antibodies work for specific viruses and invaders of the body. So there's a specific antibody that fights the flu, specific for measles, et cetera, et cetera. And for HIV, most antibodies are specific to one specific strain of HIV. So that's where those broadly neutralizing antibodies really play a huge role and make a huge difference because there may be a different strain in California that's circulating, that's in New York than a different strain in New York. And so a broadly neutralizing antibody that can neutralize both the strain in California and the strain in New York would be a really great asset to our fight against HIV. And so those are the types of antibodies that we're researching at the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. And so, like I said, antibodies can be administered through IV infusion, like it's listed or like it's shown here through this graphic, but it also can be just an injection. And it skips the step of teaching your body with a vaccine, skips that step, and it just gives you the antibodies themselves. This is kind of a picture of how it works. I have a video, but for sake of time, I can't show you the video. But the antibodies, as listed there, instead of HIV being able to attach itself to your cell and infect the cell and do damage to your body, is what it's going to do. It's going to block the tools, the apparatus, the kind of hand that the HIV uses to attach itself to grab your cell. It's going to block that, and it's going to block that HIV from infecting and doing damage and help your body clear it. This is just a little perspective on how long we've been using antibodies, this like direct antibody method of fighting disease. This is a little bit of perspective. So we've been doing this for 100 years and just giving people antibodies as an effective measure to prevent or treat disease. And we've been doing it for a lot of different viruses. And so currently we're just doing, most of our studies are phase 1 studies. And so that's kind of where we are in this process of antibody and vaccine development. We're at the phase 1 process. And so this is a little view of what our phase 1 demographics have looked like so far. And so we've been doing okay, I think, in terms of demographics. I think we can do a lot better. And that's why we come and we talk to people like you. That's why we need participation from people like you, because we want to make sure that the community is on the forefront of what we're doing and that they have a hand, and that whatever comes out, whatever is developed, whatever new development happens and revolutionizes the world, that community is at the forefront, and the people who are disproportionately impacted by HIV are the ones that receive the benefits. And with that, I think I'll stop there. So Looks like we have some questions. We have a whole faith initiative. That was going to be my next thing. I was going to be like, yeah, and so we got this faith initiative, and that's how we go out and we do all this work. We got people like Dante, who's a faith ambassador, who's doing shows and talking about HIV and vaccines and faith communities. We got our project lead, Ulysses Burley, going out there and leading this. And then Sandy Bailey is one of his faith consultants. And we have an extensive faith program with people all across the country doing this work and spreading the gospel, so to speak, about HIV vaccines and all the amazing things that are happening, getting people involved and getting people up to speed about the HIV Vaccine Trials Network and HIV research. And with that, we'll take our first question.
Hello.
Hello.
I am curious. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm gonna just stick to one. So I'm curious about, you said you were at phase 1. What is, to your knowledge, the efficacy of the, is it phase 1 for BNABs, or is it phase 1 for the other traditional vaccine? That's the first part of that question. Then what's the efficacy of it? I don't know if you have that for humans yet, but maybe you might have that information for animal trials, what the efficacy was in the animal trials.
Yeah, so I guess we can talk about BNABs first. So BNABs have been extensively studied. And so we're kind of, in some ways, those phase 1 trials are easiest because we just get a chance to look at which BNABs kind of cover the most different strains of HIV. And so what they're doing right now is just evaluating which ones cover the most. And we did a big trial, a big like phase 2B, almost a phase 3 trial called AMP, which looked at the ability for one antibody and how well it could stop HIV. And what we found from that is that AMP was, one antibody was really good at stopping one specific type of HIV, but it wasn't good at stopping others. And so what they're looking at now is how can we combine multiple antibodies, kind of like what we do in treatment, where we can combine different medications to control HIV. Can we do the same thing with BNABs? And can we combine multiple different antibodies into kind of a cocktail? And can they effectively prevent HIV? So that's kind of where we are in the phase 1s. And so they kind of just determining which 3 antibodies would be the best to move forward with. In terms of vaccine trials, I would say a lot of what I've seen lately is in like the lab stage. But there's they're looking at things like mRNA vaccines and things like that. So you get really, once you get into the lab stuff, you get really in the weeds of the science. But there is some stuff going on the vaccine side as well. I guess I talked your head off.
That comment was almost to what she said. I was a little taken aback when you said it's phase 1 trial. I was like, oh, so what's been happening? And I calculated 21 years. So it started 2002, and we are in 2023. So I was expecting something, some kind of, maybe it didn't work here, it worked there. And I think you just said some of that at least we're still in the works and something is going on at the background that we might get some more information. Because in my work, all I hear every day is, when are we getting the cure? Mm-hmm. And it's just everybody wants the cure. And I think with this is where we're going to get to something that will look like it. So I'm really curious that what's the delay? I mean, you have quite some number, 7,000 something. Mm-hmm. It's not much, but it's something. Yeah. So how do you speed it up?
I think that's the So to Daniel's point, you know, I think people are kind of spoiled with the progress of a vaccine like the COVID-19 vaccine. And so that's kind of like the elephant in the room when you talk about HIV vaccines. And one thing that people need to realize is that, to Daniel's point, there was a ton of money thrown at COVID-19 like we had not seen before. That was one point. The second point is that every scientist stopped what they did to work on COVID-19 in some shape, form, or capacity. And we don't have that sort of buy-in when it comes to HIV. HIV is in many cases still considered a moral judgment of a disease. I mean, that's something that of a vaccine, I should say. There's still moral judgments around HIV. We've seen a lot of discourse politically around communities that are disproportionately impacted by HIV, particularly LGBTQ communities across the United States, and how funding is being withheld or diverted when it comes to just HIV treatment. So now we're talking about HIV research. And so that's something that we're gearing up for, you know, as a community of researchers. Is that conversation going to impact the research conversation? Because if you don't want to give dollars for HIV treatment, is that going to carry over to HIV research? And the question is, we don't know yet. You know, we'll know soon when it comes to our next funding cycles. But this is why we need community input. This is why we need community involvement. Me going up and saying, hey, we need this money is one thing, but you all coming up as a group and mobilizing and saying this is important to us means something totally different. So that's another aspect of it, is that there's more resources poured into COVID. There was more attention from the scientific community. And then also there's not the same judgment. Like a child can have COVID and it's no big deal. You know, a child born with HIV, that's a different story. So, Daniel.
Hi,
This
I'm
is Daniel
Daniel
Griffin.
Griffin. I'm on.
Where do you work,
side.
Daniel?
I work for the HIV Vaccine Trials Network as a project manager. I think this conversation is important. And tomorrow night, 2 doors down, NIH, National Institute of Health, will be hosting a listening session, specifically involvement of women in clinical trials. So again, those slides that Dr. Elliot began with, questioning, you know, how are we getting to the end of this epidemic? Those are some of the places that we should be having these same conversations there, okay? NIH will be hosting 3 listening sessions this week, all in the same room, starting tomorrow, just FYI.
Last question, and then we have to close this session.
If you're not attending the conference, how can you be part of the listening session? If you're not attending the US conference, if it's tomorrow is when the conference starts and you won't be here, how can you be part of the listening session?
I think she's saying she won't physically
won't be here.
And so if there's a hybrid, if there's a virtual option, yeah. So we'll have to find out.
And one thing I will add is that this is not confined to one conversation. So, you know, we need legislative support across the board. So if this is important to you, make it important to your representatives in Congress, make it important to your local representatives. You know, so it's not one conversation, it's us having a conversation with our leadership in this country in general, and letting them know that this is important to us, and it needs to always be on the top of the radar. Do we have any questions online or anything online? Okay. I see you.
Carol, and then
Okay.
question, Lewis, has to do with looking at how the trust issue and with COVID. Are you guys thinking about whether or not the community will trust the vaccine?
That is a very good question. So I think COVID did some good things and it did some not so great things. It showed us ways that we can mobilize around vaccines and do some great educational work and outreach, but it also showed us how much vitriol can be elicited by a vaccine. It showed us how much misinformation can spread and be proliferated. So I would say that we're doing our best to learn those lessons from COVID-19 and take what we can to move the vaccine forward. I know that me personally, we have an effective vaccine tomorrow. And I mean, if we say 100% effective vaccine from preventing you from getting HIV tomorrow, I'm going to spend the rest of my career, probably at least the next 10 years, convincing people to take it. And that's the reality of the matter. And me personally, again, Louis saying this, not acting director, me personally, I don't know if there's any way to get around that. Just no, and considering I'm a Black man and this is important for me to that Black people are a part of this. Again, I don't know if I'm gonna get around it. Wakefield has his hand up. I gotta go to Wakefield. This one.
But for context, Wakefield was the former acting director of HVTN and is the person responsible for this funding initiative.
He is HVTN employee number 3.
I just want to acknowledge that one of the great things that came out of COVID is we as adults learned that we need to go to the pharmacy and take vaccines. And it's not a big deal. We thought it was something for the children going to school. We thought it was for other people. And we have learned that we take vaccines. I cannot watch a football game without a vaccine commercial. Okay? So change channels, okay. But what I'm saying is by the time we have an effective HIV vaccine, it'll be the stigma that we're talking about and have talked about all day that we're going to have to deal with, because people got to be looking for the next vaccine that's going to protect them. And so Dr. Elliot talked about health-seeking behavior. And one of the greatest things we can do to reduce stigma, I think, is get people to have more health-seeking behavior and see some of these HIV interventions as important as going to the gym, as important as changing their diet. And we get a chance to do that.
Thank you, Wakefield. Thank you all for allowing me to talk y'all ear off at the lunch. I appreciate y'all still being awake. I think just my last comment is that, one thing I really don't have time to talk about is the stigma. And that is really the other part, the stigma, the structural oppression that exists. That is the other part of the equation. And that's why we all need to be involved. That's why this is an all hands on deck affair. So I just want to leave you all with that and say thank you for your time.